Good day, and welcome to Chapter 9. And last time we looked a little bit at leadership and how organizations can be more successful at leading their way through a crisis. And last week you had a chance also to think about some failures of leadership in terms of major natural disasters. Today I want to talk a little bit more about what we call learning and what is a term called organizational learning. It comes from business management literature, and it's a common area that is taught in organizational communication and management courses. The basic idea is that organizations evolve. Everyone evolves. You and I evolve. We change. We get experience. We use that experience in future occasions to make better decisions. And so the older we get, sometimes it's not so much that we acquire wisdom or we're smarter. Rather, we simply have more information and we learn from that information, apply it in different ways. So if you think about an organization that is faced with a crisis, then, we sort of expect them to change. I mean, one of the expectations the public often has is if an organization makes a mistake, we're willing to allow them to make mistakes on occasion. What we don't want to see is the same mistake every time. We expect things to go wrong. We understand that organizations are not infallible. But we assume that once a crisis is significant enough and serious enough, they're going to fix it. And in doing so, then they'll continue to be a safer place. So, for example, it's not uncommon for restaurants that have had maybe a food poisoning case or even a fire or some damage. The customers will keep coming back. They'll come back believing the organization is stronger for their experience, that they'll be safer and cleaner. And they want to support the organization. And so organizational learning is one of those opportunities we talked about earlier in the course, that organizations can learn, they can grow, they can change their behavior. One of the nice things sometimes about a crisis is it gives them a chance to work more quickly to change. And so we expect them to adapt to various sorts of crisis situations. So I'm just going to review some of these opportunities, what they mean, and why they're so important to us. When we have a failure, it's not only a chance to address that particular issue, but maybe prevent future crises happening ahead of time. That's one of the reasons why organizations need to be very good at monitoring situations and anticipating what might come up next. The organization that fails to adapt and change after signs of potential crises arise is the one that's likely to fall even bigger in the future. And there's a long history of organizations that have failed to kind of pay attention to the signs that they need to respond to a situation. So anytime something goes wrong, it's an opportunity to prevent another crisis in the future and to use that as a motivator to change one's behaviors. One of the other things we've learned, the second opportunity here, is that organizations can avoid crises by learning from other organizations. I'm a real big supporter of the idea that every industry can teach its members about crises and learn from them. So even though your organization might not make a mistake or the same mistake, you can learn from the mistake or the at least experience of other organizations. So, for example, we've had a terrible number of shootings at schools, high schools, even colleges and universities. Every time a new incident occurs, we can learn something from that. The media points out the differences. People talk about how, people responded differently. And plans and projects are changed and adapted based on those experiences. Your job someday, regardless of the industry you live in and participate in and work in, is to know what's happening to your peers, know what's happening to your competition, understand what could happen to you. And by learning from other people's crises, you can avoid them yourself. So instead of just sitting back and smugly going, hey, we didn't make this mistake, learn from those experiences and incorporate what you can learn from their experience into your own. The third opportunity is that training and planning should preserve those lessons. One of the difficulty we have in organizations at every level is what we call institutional memory or organizational memory. CEOs, they move from job to job every few years, 5 years maybe. People come and go in positions of leadership. Your generation especially is changing jobs at a fairly rapid rate. So even if a crisis occurs in an organization, say 5 years ago, most of the people who address that crisis are not there anymore. So there has to be an effort to write these things down, to practice those responses, to make a plan that is specific and not just in people's heads, not just depending on what someone did at one point and assuming they can do it again. You need to train and plan and preserve those efforts, make them part of your organization's environment, so you have that memory, you retained those memories. It used to be easier to do this, but not anymore. So it's really important for organizations after a crisis to write it all down, create an after-crisis report of some kind, and then incorporate those suggestions and recommendations into their training for future situations. One of the other things we need to know is we have to unlearn outdated and ineffective procedures. A few years ago, I was renewing my Red Cross certificate and realized that they've changed the recommendations they make on doing CPR. I didn't know that. They give you new suggestions and new process, and it's less about breathing and it's more about promoting a heartbeat. Every organization has old ideas about how to respond to a crisis or where. So we always need to update our procedures, our policies, our situations. And so recognize the fact that with change then comes a responsibility to learn that. So the learning opportunities of a crisis are immense, and this is one of at least the positive outcomes that a crisis has. This is the motivation to change your organization. This gives you the justification for faster change. If you've been a part of any organization, you realize it takes forever to get people to change anything. People don't like change. A crisis gives you justification, a nudge that pushes people to maybe act more quickly. Gives the lawyers a reason to force a company to change more rapidly. The company needs to show change so their customers feel reassured. So the learning opportunities and what we can use that crisis for are important. So always assessing and viewing a crisis as that opportunity for a future, better, stronger organization is necessary. Put a couple readings again in place here, and these readings are all designed to help you think about organizations and how they function. Vail's article on mindful learning is a model of mindfulness. Please look at that model and kind of learn it a little bit. I think it's a really good example of trying to create a model for proceeding through a crisis and afterwards, and helping an organizations retain and clarify and learn from those experiences. So it's a good model to follow. It might be useful if you are doing a project for class that has something to do along these lines. But Vail's work on a mindful learning model is a really good one. I wish it were being taught more outside of the academic range, but I think it eventually will. And so this concept of mindfulness is important. There's a term that we call high reliability organizations, organizations that are extremely dangerous but are extremely safe. To launch an aircraft, a plane off an aircraft carrier is tremendously complex, highly dangerous, but they do so with precision and success because of mindfulness. And it's a way of training employees, it's a way of thinking as an organization. And a lot of you, if you deal with any kind of organization that has any sort of danger or threat associated with it, mindfulness is an important component to learn about and concept, and also to implement. The Miller and Littlefield article on ConAgra is a good example of organizations failing to move forward and learn from their past mistakes. If a company encounters multiple crises, doesn't change their response, doesn't evolve, never improves, they're going to continue to fail, and they might fail even bigger. Or they will make the same mistakes that created the crisis to begin with. So it's not uncommon for leadership to change in organizations, for ideas to evolve, and the ConAgra is a good situation example of that. One of the classic examples in crisis management is Tylenol back in the early 80s. I think it was 82 or 83, 82 probably, where they had the problem with contaminated Tylenol caplets. The company was widely praised for their very successful response to that crisis. Many years later, they had some other contamination issues with some of their medications, and they slipped up and they did a bad job, and people were just like, "Your Tylenol, you had this 10 years ago, and what if you haven't done it again?" And so Tylenol, like ConAgra, showed that just because you even are successful once doesn't make you invincible, and that in many times the failure to continue to change and evolve and grow your responses means that you'll fail the next time. And that even hurts more because you could have been successful, you had been successful, and people are not in favor of you anymore. A third thing I've asked you to look at in this set of readings is an article by Reynolds and Seeger. Seeger is one of your textbook authors. They present what they call the CERT model. It's a model for both risk and crisis response. It incorporates both of these concepts together about how should organizations respond to a crisis. The reason I give you this is the model. This is how the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and other government agencies and some corporations, again, have learned to model a good and effective response to crisis, to integrate their components or their thinking about both risk and crisis communication planning and execution. So we need to recognize how important it is to stay on a message, to assess what we say. I mentioned in this, like Ebola, we've got another outbreak of Ebola occurring, but historically, things like Ebola or anthrax was back during the crisis where they came up with this model. We need good, consistent, clear messaging. We need a way to think about how to structure our message, who to choose as our spokespeople. And the government has made a real effort, especially through the CERT model at times, to find a way to better structure and organize their responses to a particular crisis. So this chapter is a really good kind of more of an uplifting idea about why organizations can actually be stronger as a result of a crisis, not weaker. We certainly never want these terrible things to happen to our organizations. We never want to see the loss of life, but we realize and recognize that with those crises are opportunities for improvement. And the models here, the mindfulness model, the CERT model, are both good examples and ways for you to think about how to implement this in a structured, clear way. So I'm hoping that information is valuable for you. We'll move on then to Chapter 10, and I'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you.